Ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome you to this, the fourth of the Gifford Lectures, delivered by our very eminent guest lecturer, Professor Sarah Coakley. For those of you who may not have been at earlier lectures, Sarah is the Norris Hulse Professor of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. Now, before I introduce tonight's lecture, I want to mention to you that there are some events outside the lecture series that may be of interest to you involving Sarah and the theme for these lectures. On Sunday morning, Sarah will be preaching in King's College Chapel here on the campus. And the service, as usual, starts at 11 a.m. and you're very welcome to join that service as part of the congregation and to hear Sarah preach. And then on Sunday evening at 5 o'clock, back in this venue, there will be a screening of the film of Gods and Men. And this film, which is very highly regarded and recommended by Sarah, fits very well with the theme of these lectures, and you're very welcome to join us for that screening. Tonight's lecture is on the topic Ethics, Cooperation and the Gender Wars, Prospects for a New Asceticism. I'll hand over to Sarah and there'll be time for some questions at the end. Sarah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret. In my last lecture, I considered how evolutionary ethics as a category needed to be stretched in its current theoretical presumptions, from an almost solely biological interest in individual genetic inheritance and the maintenance of cooperative conditions merely to foster that, to a consideration of the distinctive behavioral and affective features of cooperation in the higher mammals, and beyond that, to an analysis of the uniquely intentional characteristics of human altruism, sometimes explicitly fired motivationally by religious beliefs and inspirational exemplars. I asked what metaethical theory would best explain the evolutionary evidences, both animal and human, thus assembled. And I showed how both neo-Aristotelian and Kantian accounts could have distinct merits in this regard, albeit in contrasting and complementary ways, and that both of these would open up naturally therefrom to the question of God. I also noted the problem of accounting for what might be called an excess in evolutionary cooperation and altruism, for those moments of an intensely sacrificial undertaking for others which seem not to be constrainable into any current mathematical calculus of payoffs or benefits. Such saintly or supernormal activity thus remains up for special deliberation. Are we to pass over it as yet another spandrel which in effect defies scientific meaning, may perhaps safely be hived off, therefore, by the theologians into the realm of grace, and will have no further ongoing evolutionary implications? Or are we somehow to incorporate it into a revised conception of evolutionary thinking which can admit of potential new levels of influence from such saintly examples as these in the so-called cultural realm? Recall again Sober and Wilson's prophetic remark: replacing kin selection theory with multi-level selection theory is like shutting off the spotlight and illuminating the entire stage. It is that entire stage that we are after. These then are the questions which we shall pick up again today in a slightly different way as we turn to consider another realm of intense intra-theoretic debate in evolutionary biology, that of sexual selection. Darwin had lastingly influential views on this topic, as we shall see, and overall, at least up to recently, there has been a surprising reluctance to challenge his theory in any fundamental way. In recent decades, the investigation of the intersection of sexual selection theory with kin selection and other forms of cooperation has, for some empirical biologists, been a point of increasingly fruitful focus. But by and large, mathematical biologists, such as Novak, have taken very little, actually almost no notice, of the differential influences of gender or of sexual roles in discerning patterns of cooperation. It's a real blind spot. One has to wonder, therefore, whether this omission is consciously strategic or unconsciously averse. My own suspicion is that the recent dominance of the inclusive fitness theory of kinship, now under new critique, as we have discussed, has tended to divert investigators from looking closely at other ways in which sex or gender may be intrinsically tied up with cooperative tendencies. In tonight's lecture, then, I shall be broadly arguing three things. First, I shall cast the current evolutionary debates about gender and cooperation into a wider historical framework and show how gender prescriptions about evolutionary life have long been a feature of biological investigation. This is not new news to any feminists amongst you, I'm sure, but it is still a telling feature of biological investigation and requires constant methodological vigilance and resistance to either reigning cultural presumptions or merely passing ideology. Secondly, in the central sections of this lecture, I shall analyse a particular current debate about sex and gender and cooperation, which has brought two leading evolutionary biologists into combat with one another, and whose outcomes are especially instructive for the Aristotelian theory of biological flourishing, which I want to continue to commend to you. As Darwin's theory of sexual selection has come under fire and has needed modification and extension, so new understandings of the relation between sex, gender, and cooperation in humans have emerged, and are in turn being found, in inverted commas, by biologists in animal behaviours which up to now have been sidelined or ignored. So there is another hermeneutical circle here, just as we saw there was in standard game theory when applied to evolution, another arena in which stock narratives and meaning systems may either disclose or occlude aspects of biological reality. Thirdly, I shall gather the pieces from this investigation and propose a possible lesson for the human realm, though please be assured here that I shall not make the mistake of naively drawing such a lesson by a false form of direct transference or without passing go in critical philosophical terms. This lesson falls under the category of the ascetic. It draws its inspiration from a period in Christian thinking at the time of the birth of Christian monasticism, when new forms of cooperative behavior were being devised to counteract the negative effects of Christianity's recent collusion with imperial power. It was at this point that certain leading thinkers presented striking theories of virginity and celibacy, which were intended to be integrated as monastic cells into the life of the Christian body as a whole, and to involve also a transformation of the relation between rich and poor. I want to reflect back on that development with an evolutionary eye. I want to see if the ascetic lessons of the late 4th century can recall us now to a certain prophetic new engagement with a life of flourishing, which is both cooperative, sacrificial, and fertile. On this rendition, as we shall see, fertility can be construed either physically or spiritually. Of course, I shall have ultimately to face the obvious objection that such monastic ideals seem to have currently atrophied almost completely in the contemporary West, but I think that there are reasons for that which can also be fruitfully explored. But first, a brief but instructive trip back to the 19th century, because the shock value will brace us for critical thinking in the contemporary theoretical realm of Darwinian sexual selection. In a brilliant short article on 19th century cultural developments by the historian of science Thomas Dixon, the gendered dimensions of the then new ideal of altruism, not, you recall, a term ever used by Darwin himself, but coined by Auguste Comte and avidly taken up by Herbert Spencer, amongst others, are illuminatingly exposed and explored in relation to Darwin's own rather different thoughts about sacrifice and gender. Note that the idea that altruism, an initially secularized notion for Comte, was a significant force in human and political life as an other-regarding instinct or intention, and was not devised by Darwin, it was more Comtean Spencerian, but it surfaced at roughly the same time as Darwin was writing his own important late work, The Descent of Man, on topics such as group selection and sexual selection. It was, however, the idea of altruism that was then promulgated by many social commentators and clerics as an essentially gendered affair. The influence of a slightly later book by Patrick Geddes and Arthur Thompson, The Evolution of Sex, of 1889, was particularly profound in this regard. These authors drove a certain wedge between egoism, which they saw as arising from the instinct for survival, and altruism, which, interestingly, they connected specifically with sexual functions and reproductive instincts. In their account of an evolutionary hierarchy of altruistic ascent, however, mothers alone achieve the pinnacle place. Here the descriptive has become the normative. The romantic angel in the house reigns supreme, but her glory is strictly circumscribed by role. She is specifically in charge of the demanding altruistic dimensions of life, even though its benefits obviously also accrue to men. Another influential voice which promulgated the gendered rendition of altruism, this time from here in Scotland, was that of the popular evangelical preacher Henry Drummond. In his Lowell lectures given in Boston on the ascent of man, a deliberate and ironic allusion to Darwin's The Descent of Man, he effected a creative blend of optimistically construed evolutionary theory, evangelical hope, and what I can only call gender romanticism. Drummond, as Dixon puts it, I quote, saw evolution as an epic love story, starting with the protoplasmic fission of the earliest single-celled organisms and ending with the emergence of the human mother, the peak of altruistic love. Women, too, joined in this evolutionary propaganda game, though with slightly more critical discernment about how it might be turned against them. The redoubtable Arabella Buckley, who had been a secretary to one of Darwin's mentors, Sir Charles Lyell, and became a popularizer of stories of natural history for the sake of moral lessons for children. The interest in entomology at this time, and especially in the sacrificial lives of worker ants and bees, was as keen as it again became at the time of E.O. Wilson's sociobiology, but for very different reasons than that later propulsion to a reductive narrative of inclusive fitness. For now, and true to the late Victorian era, all the focus was on the worker ants and bees' remarkable sense of selfless duty, an ironically selective rendition, of course, given the queen bee's primary act of violence that sustains the whole enterprise. But Buckley was careful to distinguish insects' faceless commitment to a shared community from specifically human developments of what she called virtuous bonds of affection. And far less than male writers of the time did she allocate that latter responsibility specifically to women. True, admirable human altruism was found most interesting in the mother-child relationship, but no less in friendship more generally. If these lessons from the past about gender, evolution, and altruism now strike us as embarrassing, then, we should be embarrassed for a discerning theoretical purpose and not fail in due course to turn the mirror similarly on ourselves. Virginia Woolf, lecturing in 1931 on professions for women, described how she'd had to fling an inkpot at the inherited archetype of this altruistic angel in the house in order to purge her thoroughly restrictive impact on her own female literary creativity. For it is, notes Woolf, I quote, far harder to kill a phantom than a reality, close quote. The same might be said, however, of the rather different and equally long shadow of Darwin on sexual selection, which, as the eminent feminist philosopher of science Evelyn Fox Keller well analyzes, has gathered a cumulative stock of extra images and ideas in the 20th century that even Darwin would probably not recognize as his own. In particular, the intensified and pervasive stress on individual autonomy in the genetic evolutionary game of competition has, Fox Keller writes, also colored the rendition of Darwin's views on sex and has worked to, quote, permit a tacit incorporation of ideology into scientific theory and, simultaneously, protect participants from recognition of such ideological influences, close quote. Caveat lector. It is time then to return to Darwin's own views on sexual selection and to try to keep alert to any ideology, whether his interpreters, or ours. The first point we note is that the matter is for Darwin completely separable from his other suggestive and prescient comments in the same volume, The Descent of Man, about the sacrificial power of groups, which we've already discussed. Sexual selection, in contrast, is in fact for him quite a narrow theory about male adornment and competition for sexual favours. What animated Darwin initially in his theory of sex selection was the puzzle about how elaborate or large male adornment characteristics in some species had been selected for. Again, a teleological question pressed. What are a buck deer's antlers for, since they do not seem to have importance for survival as such? The other species which particularly entranced Darwin in the same regard was, of course, the peacock, where the male is adorned with elaborate and colourful plumage completely different from that of the peahen. Darwin's well-known hypothesis was that these sexual differences must have come about in relation to mating practices. Note the emphasis here on male mating rather than on sexual reproduction or parenting more generally, and that the one crucial power females possessed was the choice to favour more ornamented males, thus creating a male competitive scenario such as the antler contest. Particularly interesting here is Darwin's assertion that females thereby freely indicate their special aesthetic sensibilities. That's what we have. Yet seemingly will always choose the more exaggerated or beautiful male adornments, such as in turn to pass them on to their sons. Females also then purportedly always prefer victorious males in the aggressive games of male sexual competition. And in an oft-quoted remark, probably regarded as completely unexceptional in his Victorian age, Darwin avers that, I quote, "Males of almost all animals have stronger passions than females," and, quote, "that the female, with the rarest of exceptions, is less eager than the male. She is coy," close quote. The generalization here across species, given Darwin's immense learning about their variety, is of course fairly breathtaking, especially so because it now insidiously seems to bespeak a norm. An over-eager female would be an exception, even an aberration, it seems, while a weak-passioned male would presumably be selected out. What are we to make of all this now? Is it true? What is remarkable is that for the most part, this theory about particular male adornments has been regarded as unexceptionable, even obvious. It does, of course, seem to have clear explanatory power for those species where exaggerated male adornments are to be found. But in the era of the genome, the theory in its original Darwinian form has tended to become generalized, but also, paradoxically, at the same time, individualized in a new and somewhat insidious way that we are already familiar with from the inclusive fitness debates. The neo-Darwinian story may now seem to mandate a norm of male promiscuity in order that he might spread his genetic material as widely as possible, and of female caution given the investment involved in the production of eggs and the bearing of offspring. Caution by discerningly choosing the best male genetic material on hand. This is, of course, a far cry from Darwin's own focused intentions in The Descent of Man on particular male adornments. So what then are we now to make of this theory, and how does it relate, or strikingly fail to relate, to the issue of cooperation in kinship and other groups, which so far has been our focus of investigation in this series? Enter here a remarkably controversial figure in American empirical biology and ecology, Joan, previously John Roughgarden, a brilliant scientist who as a young man had an extraordinarily rapid promotion up the ladder of academic success, from a Harvard doctorate straight to an immediate tenure-track position at Stanford, and an equally early election to the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Then, in John's early 50s, came the sex change from, I gather, what has always been an intersex physiology. And immediately the new Joan plunged into a full-out attack on Darwinian and neo-Darwinian sexual selection theories in two remarkable but inevitably controversial books. The first, Evolution's Rainbow, from 2004, which she'd just finished when she came out to speak to our research group at Harvard, is, amongst other things, an amassment of weird and wonderful accounts of natural sexual characteristics and behaviors in the wild that do not conform at all to Darwin's paradigms, and indeed thoroughly queer the evolutionary pitch, as Roughgarden fully intends. The main focus in this part of the book is on ingenious species which simply do not behave in a sexually binary way. For instance, the clownfish, that can change from male to female if the other sex is removed, or the hamlet, Hyperplectrus nigricans, which is a simultaneous hermaphrodite, or, in more one-off accidental cases, the eastern grey kangaroo, where intersexed individuals have been discovered on more than one occasion, with a penis as well as a pouch equipped with mammary glands. Or, even more extraordinarily, the well-documented case of an intersexed American black bear, not this one, which managed to give birth through its penis. I wish I had a picture of that, but I couldn't get it. These cases are certainly intriguing and, of course, give the lie to any dogmatic imposition of normative sexual rules on animal life. But in this first book of Roughgarden's on gender, the main message is undeniably ideological and proud of it. As Sarah Hardy comments in her generally appreciative review, the book has three agendas, only one being the display of strange and overlooked examples from the wild. The others being, firstly, I quote, a passionate cry from the heart for greater understanding of sexual diversity in nature and greater tolerance for all those humans who do not fit comfortably into male or female binary categories. And secondly, the rather incautious first hatchet job on Darwin's own sexual selection theory. Hardy is somewhat rueful about the latter, pointing out that she and Fox Keller and other feminist philosophers of science and sociobiologists had been calling for a broadening of the theory to include selection pressures at more levels since the 1970s. I quote, "This evolutionary biologist becomes a woman, and only then do the problems occur to her," she quips. Almost inevitably, given the ideological tone of the book and the deliberately provocative other examples of so-called homosexual behaviors in some animals, this first book produced a roar of protest, and there were at least 10 published letters of criticism from about 40 scientists, some of them quite vitriolic in tone. Yet many other reviewers were polite and responsive. Roughgarden had certainly opened up a sexual Pandora's box, and the issue now was how to carry through the critique of Darwin's original theory with much greater precision. The task was performed in Roughgarden's more recent The Genial Gene of 2009. In my view and others, much the more nuanced and persuasive book, though still marred by a kind of pendulum swing overstatement of her new theory of reproductive processes, of parental and shared cooperation rather than of sexual selection, which she plans to replace the Darwin story altogether with. The trouble, I think, is that Roughgarden overstates her case, for there is no reason I can see why the Darwinian story should not continue to be utilized to explain some male ornaments while being decommissioned from its more general theory of normative gender behaviors. But she is deliciously funny in the process, as she spoofs the lacunae and overdeterminations of Darwin's thesis. And she manages to come up with 26 examples of sexual behaviors that seemingly will not fit the paradigm at all, and thus must therefore, in her view, cause it to be replaced by a much more inclusive account of what she calls social selection, in which the focus now is firmly on the successful rearing of young, rather than merely on the number of times the male scores. As for her own account of peacocks and peahens, she makes the proposal that rather than taking the male plumage as the problem to be explained, we should read the female lack of such plumage as a camouflaging adaptation, secondarily, which has saved her from predators when with young. In the case of the blue tit, in contrast, it simply does not seem to be the case, according to a really in-depth recent study, that there is any sexual selection for brighter head caps. I quote, "Models of indirect sexual selection predict that sexually selected traits should have high heritability, that the magnitude of genetic variation in fitness should be substantial, and that there is significant positive genetic covariation between the sexually selected traits and fitness." But in fact, 3 years of intense investigations of blue tits in the United Kingdom found that none of these hypotheses were borne out. Instead, it seemed that environmental rather than genetic factors were much more implicated, and that there was no very clear correlation between the blueness of the cap and the fitness of the bird. Roughgarden is particularly delicious when attacking the neo-Darwinian sex selection theories of Angus Bateman, who did a celebrated and lengthy study of Drosophila flies, which was published in 1948 and has remained a landmark point of reference ever since. In an intensification of the Darwinian narrative about happy male promiscuity and female coyness, Bateman claimed, and I think it's quite interesting that this is just after the war, that male fitness in these flies increased with the number of matings, whereas for females, fitness was independent of the number of mates beyond one, since only one male was necessary to supply fertilization of the eggs. Bateman couched his conclusions in the following notorious language, I quote, "These results were due to ardent, indiscriminate males and passive, choosy females," close quote. Unfortunately, a whole series of critical assessments of Bateman's conclusions have now embarrassingly shown that he hardly ever actually observed his flies, and that even his graphs, which plot the results, do not seem to correlate with his conclusions. For Roughgarden, this is one more nail in the coffin of old-style sexual selection. But the key issue, of course, is what can she put in its place? It is here that things get a lot more speculative and, as Roughgarden herself admits, still open-ended. What she wants to do is to sweep away sexual selection theory altogether, along with a theory of cooperation primarily founded in kin selection. And here there's an ironic convergence with Novak's and Wilson's recent work, though for different reasons. The hypothesis that is emerging is a new form of what Roughgarden calls social selection. Boldly, she wants to place the spotlight on cooperative, nurturing behaviors, especially in common birds such as the robin, for whom nurturing behaviors are not necessarily founded solely on the basis of mating couples alone, as you may have noticed in your gardens, but may involve sharing responsibilities for rearing within wider circles. The hypothesis also seeks to accommodate an account of so-called extra-pair parenting, the now well-documented phenomenon of bird nests often including eggs not belonging to both of the pair actually tending the nest. To a strict Darwinian, of course, this would probably be a sign of female cheating to gain better genes from another male. But the evidence for this hypothesis are rather obscure. May it just be that a certain amount of work is being shared around. What Roughgarden is after, of course, is a new ideology of shared parental and wider group responsibilities in which the principles of sexual selection as such no longer apply. So her societal vision is one in which, a number of individuals may rear the next generation, including some who are not actually related to the offspring. The trouble is that her slightly botched attempts to give mathematical credence for this idea in terms of group selection is so far under a cloud and has received very poor reviews. She's trying to get it into a mathematical formula, and we all know that accounting for multi-level or group selection mathematically is particularly tricky. Overall, she does much better when exposing the failures of sexual selection explanations in particular cases. Here is another, the lark bunting, whose genetic success as a male from year to year can now be demonstrated not to be in any way consistently correlated with any one particular attractive male characteristic. She's better at debunking than she has done so far in building a clearly enunciated new vision with mathematical cogency. Nonetheless, Roughgarden's work is having its ripple effects. Only consider 2 recent studies by scholars unconnected to her program. A study of common eider ducks, in which eggs from other mothers are parasitically laid in the nest and then hatched by the minder, though possibly this is kin-related cooperation, because it's not quite clear whether the extra eggs come from a sister or a cousin. And then, even more remarkably, an astounding study, I think, of successful unrelated same-sex female rearing in Laysan albatrosses in Oahu. This study is particularly interesting because what probably lies behind this phenomenon is a skew in the population of the albatrosses, causing there to be a superfluity of females who then have improvised new childcare arrangements without an actual male presence for each nest. This would doubtless warm Roughgarden's heart for other social reasons, but what it does point to is the importance of variable environmental conditions which need to be factored into any complexified account of the relation of sexual selection processes, kin selection, and forms of cooperation. Now, oddly, it is the scholar that Roughgarden is most inclined to attack, the person she calls the Dean of Sexual Selection Studies, Professor Tim Clutton-Brock of my own university, Cambridge, who is perhaps in a better position than any other researcher to expose the mechanics of how cooperation, kinship, and sexual selection intertwine in one highly cooperative species whom Clutton-Brock has been studying for many years now, the meerkats of the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. Tim Clutton-Brock has been following a huge number of families and groups of these meerkats for several generations, and because they are relatively easy to catch and quickly blood test and tag, he and his team have an impeccably clear record of which animals are related to which, how long they live, how and when they breed, and what activities and functions they perform in their families and groups over the years. I don't think there's any such extensive such study of any other groups of cooperating animals over generations. And they are impeccably related now to a genetic analysis. It's tremendously exciting to talk to Tim about these findings, because he is rare not only in his range of experience of one group of animals, but as an historian originally, as an undergraduate, he has a strong grasp of how evolutionary theory has grown and changed and where its pinch points now are. And despite being quite heavily and I think unfairly attacked by Roughgarden on more than one occasion, he has remained on the whole courteous and willing to learn from her. In particular, in a generous review article of her work in Science for December 2007, Clutton-Brock acknowledges that the evolution of secondary sexual characters in males and the distribution of sex differences are more complex than Darwinian theory would have it. Though this does not mandate the rejection of sexual selection theories altogether. For Clutton-Brock, they simply have to become more nuanced and complex. In particular, I quote, "The operation of sexual selection in females has received relatively little attention." Darwin didn't think about it at all. He looked only at males. For instance, I quote Clutton-Brock, "In many animals, competition between females for breeding opportunities is intense, and it's females who show pronounced secondary character. This happens in polyandrous birds, for instance, the female African jacana on the top left, where males invest heavily in parental care, and females compete intensely for breeding opportunities and often end up being larger than the males." I quote, "Female competition for breeding opportunities is also intense in a number of social mammals where female rank and breeding success are closely correlated. This is true of Clutton-Brock's Kalahari meerkats, B, of spotted hyenas, C, and in savanna baboons, which have particularly pronounced secondary sexual characteristics, not perhaps the most attractive feature of their bodies. What Clutton-Brock is positing here is that many Darwinians have continued to be fooled by the presumption that only males are promiscuous and only females coy. Conditions in the field suggest a huge range of possibilities here, but do not undermine the basic idea of sexual selection, that it is driven by the mechanics of attracting mates. However, Clutton-Brock admits that the theory, though in framework robust, still needs much greater clarification and investigation in detail. We simply do not know about a lot of relevant facts here, he says. For instance, what exactly compels competition in sexual selection? Is this just a habit? And what are individual animals actually competing for? Is it simply for mating, or is something else going on? Nor do we really know what drives the choice of a mate. Is it really all about ensuring genetic inheritance? After all those years of looking at meerkats, Clutton-Brock is not completely sure. What he is sure about is any simplistic account of this is fishy. Now, despite a further and slightly less generous spat with Rough Garden more recently then, Clutton-Brock is certainly willing to consider ways that cooperation of various sorts may be interacting with other factors in reproduction and rearing, though, as one of the signatories to the letter that riposted to Novak, Wilson and Tarnita on eusociality, Clutton-Brock stands by the inclusive fitness hypothesis, at least for now, if only because he actually knows from his meerkat population that virtually all of their cooperative behaviors are kin-related. I mean, he actually knows they're related to one another. Meerkats are, in fact, involved in a remarkable range of such cooperative undertakings, as Clutton-Brock's many publications indicate in detail. They do costly sentinel work, for instance, and they also share both babysitting duties for non-offspring and provisioning duties for them as well. The especially exciting thing about Clutton-Brock and his team's most recent studies, however, is that they are beginning to be able to give a diachronic account of what sorts of cooperative behaviors any one meerkat, male or female, may be engaged in a lifetime. We've never been able to do this before. Meerkat groups are very hierarchical, and as we've already noted, they engage in extremely competitive behaviors between females. So whether one is sent to be a sentinel at any one time or to do more lowly babysitting is very much a matter of where one sits in the hierarchy, both in terms of age and of other factors which may affect one's standing in the group. Any grandparents here, human ones I mean, may be interested to note that for meerkats, babysitting duties intensify with age, and this duty tends to be left to subordinates amongst the older animals. Marked differences in the tendency to cooperate can now be traced, therefore, across the meerkat population, leading to fascinating questions about whether habit inculcates such patterns, or whether it is sheerly a matter of dominance and subordination, and if so, on what basis. I believe that Clutton-Brock is on the edge of further discoveries on that front, to judge from a recent conversation. Oh, who's that? So what finally does meerkat wisdom, let's have Professor Alexander supply us with, where our main issue of the intersection of cooperation, sexual selection, and kinship is concerned? The answer surely lies in a rich, complicated, and highly evolved set of behaviors, which together serve the group as a whole and involve almost all animals at some point in some form of costly activities, which may nonetheless also be balanced by periods of greater dominance and aggression. Meerkats are, in sum, one of the most cooperative species in the animal kingdom, and while they do not approach the empathetic affectivity of the chimps, their sophisticated multi-level cooperative systems are much more developed than any of those that the chimp has, and extraordinarily fine-tuned, not only for mere survival, but, as I would want to put it, for active flourishing. A study of meerkat cooperative life is a study of richly evolved patterns of sharing and mutual support. So now I come finally for today to a very different set of reflections which will launch us into our last two lectures. I call this a speculative coda on human lessons that might be learnt from these reflections on gender and sexuality. At this point, we must sternly remind ourselves that no crass or direct transferences can be made from the animal world. Yet we also note that certain dogmas of 20th century empirical biology, the inclusive fitness obsession with individual genes, the unthinking commitment to a binary theory of gender more read into the empirical evidences rather than out of them, are successively coming under threat, albeit not without screams of protest and considerable uncertainty about what will replace them. So as with the game theoretical arena, so here too we are in a period of extraordinary transformation theoretically in biology. So as the hermeneutical terrain of evolutionary theory shifts, so too we realize that something in our own imaginations about the possibilities of the human may be shifting with it. We do not see ourselves in the ant or meerkat colony, but we do see there forms of life which cause us to reflect afresh about the success or otherwise of our own societal arrangements, about our current obsession with the sexual binary and with so-called sexual orientation, an entirely late modern appellation, or about our failures in mutual support and aid to the poor of our own country, let alone those of other less fortunate places. With all the riches of our humanly evolved biology, so much more intensely evolved than the creatures we've been looking at, and all our mental power, why are our cultural imaginations seemingly so cramped and our altruistic capacities so meagre? Perhaps, after all, theology may need to come to our aid. So let me leave you tonight with some suggestive thoughts from the late 4th century, when a collection of remarkable theologians called the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, his friend, and Gregory of Nyssa, his brother, themselves connected with the emerging monastic movement, but also living as bishops and public teachers in the church, also reflected afresh on what the meaning of the cooperative undertaking of those in different portions of the church might imply for the state and for the world. Their thinking was, in fact, I think it's not inappropriate to say, a sort of new form of cultural evolution, because they were consciously repositioning the vision of the corporate identity of the church, one which had been inherited from the early apostles and from the period of persecution as a minority, but now had to relate to two very different new realities. First, its accommodation into the Pax Romana, with all the status and potential corruption that that might imply. And secondly, its relation to the new monastic movements, themselves protests against worldly accommodation and renewed and intense quests in prayer for the perfection that Jesus had enjoined on his followers. So why do I think this particular period of theologizing is of such potential interest, both philosophically and spiritually, for the essentially biological concerns I have been tracing in these last three lectures? Let me leave you here tonight with 3 points for reflection. First, the task of discerning, so to speak, what unit of evolution one belongs to, culturally speaking now, is of primary interest importance. If one's life is not dominated by sheer genetic propulsion, or by Girard's primary violence, or by mere immediate bodily desires, then the choice and type of group one primarily belongs to is, as we understand with greater clarity now after discussions of evolutionary cooperation and of altruism, one of enormous importance. The vision of a Basil of Caesarea or a Gregory of Nyssa, someone of whom I've written a great deal and is probably one of my favorite Christian theologians, was of a church which contained within it the ascetic vocation in greater and lesser degrees of intensity as a sort of perpetual reminder of its true direction and purpose. For Gregory of Nyssa, in his first work, the De Virginitate, written bemusingly enough when he was actually married, marriage is itself seen as an asceticism, not as high as good celibacy, but good marriage is infinitely better for him than bad celibacy. Both vocations, marriage and celibacy, commitments to fidelity, share the same goal of the purification and right direction of desire towards God. But rather, as Novak and Wilson now theorize an ant colony as one body, so the late 4th century theologians, going back to Paul on the body in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12, but placing those insights now into the context of establishment and continuing ascetic resistance, we're attempting a group unit of evolution with appropriate roles and goals, and cohering a Trinitarian doctrine to it, which was being devised afresh to fit. My point here is that the ascetic sacrificial role is one that no society can do without. And if it refuses this goal, and unthinkingly demands such sacrifice of those who have not themselves made the choice for sacrifice, the poor, the old, the neglected, then this is bad sacrifice and only leads to violence. Thoughts on costly cooperation here, altruism in human terms, must be aligned with a theory of the group or groups as a whole and of what the boundaries of these groups are. There is something genuinely interesting here to be learnt, I think, from the work on game theory and cooperation and altruism in this arena. Secondly, on sex and gender. Gregory of Nyssa also, and not coincidentally, I believe, had a rich, surprising, and ascetic perspective on the intrinsic malleability of gender, as we would now call it. I cannot imagine what he would have thought of something like Darwin's sexual selection theory with its rigid binaries and roles. He does himself quite often enunciate what he takes to be the worldly view of a clear gender binary, which has its uses, he thinks, only for the immature. But he contrasts that with what happens to a person whose desire is primarily and focusedly fixed on God. It was his ascetic sister, Macrina, who for Gregory and his brother Basil represented the heights of the ascetic life. And she, too, confounded gender expectations and roles simply by being who she was. He says at one point, she could have been a man, given her ascetic eros. I am struck, therefore, by the extraordinary fixity in modern biological thinking about gender presumptions, and the only recent manifestation of real disease with these poorly theorized dogmas. While evolutionary history is, of course, about reproduction and survival at base, it is also of necessity, as we've seen, as we've illumined more of the evolutionary stage, about ingenuity, flexibility, response to new environmental conditions, and, above all, the importance of mutual support in cooperation. To this extent, Rough Garden's intemperate tipping up of the sexual apple cart in evolutionary theory is a thought-provoking experiment in ideas, and opens us up even to the variety of such manifestations of cooperation in the animal world, as we've seen. The ascetic human celibate vocation is, of course, a particular resistance to a merely biological understanding of evolutionary forces, but as such, it can be astonishingly fruitful, creative, and transformative. Thirdly, and lastly, the issue of identification with the poor. This, too, is a specifically human variant of altruistic cooperation, unless we count those telling dolphin instances of rescuing other dolphins or attending them in their last hour, as it were, as prefigurements of such human altruism. But in some of the most lovely sermons from the patristic era, the Cappadocians muse on the implications of Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and weave it into their vision of how the whole and the parts of society and the church fit together so as to include and indeed celebrate the importance of the poor for the whole. In a remarkable such sermon, Gregory of Nyssa tells his flock that to learn to tend the beggars and lepers at the gate in Constantinople is to learn how to see the face, the prosopon, he actually uses the word that's used in the Christological controversy, of Christ. Moreover, it isn't just the job of the monks to deal with them, though that is indeed part of the role of the new urban monasteries that the Cappadocians fostered in Byzantium. For Gregory, the erotic life of marriage, once children are grown and gone away, should be rechanneled, find its completion in such service to the poor, where again, normal gender roles are strangely upturned and transformed. Astonishing idea that your sexual life is for the production of children, but then there's something else that you do with your erotic life. Your erotic life gets rechanneled into this energy to work for the poor and to have your vision transformed in seeing Christ in the poor. Now, why am I telling you all this? And why am I telling you it at the end of a lecture on sex, cooperation, and gender? The answer is that the Cappadocians, I believe, knew how these particular themes hung intrinsically together for the church's and the world's flourishing in ways that we as a modern Western society have largely forgotten. And yet, that strands and debates in contemporary evolutionary theory, oddly, are now causing us to reconsider all at once. That sacrifice, rightly understood, can be generative and transformative. That gender, rightly understood, can be malleable and transformative under the imprint of well-directed desire. And that a society which cooperates in the service of its poor is the only truly flourishing society. Could it be then that, as I have hinted more than once, the forms of evolutionary sacrifice we have so far examined demand some higher completion in the realm of cultural evolution and theology? And if so, how can this idea be anything more than an arbitrary preference for the already converted Christian? I'm going to return to that issue pointedly next Tuesday when I consider afresh the difficult philosophical issues of evolutionary teleology. But if you want your imaginations cracked open further to this possibility in the meantime, I do warmly invite you to attend the showing of the film of Gods and Men here on Sunday evening at 5. It is one of the most remarkable films of recent decades, and one that you won't forget in a hurry. It is about the productive force of sacrifice and its effect on a community. I thank you for your attention.
Once again, a fascinating, thought-provoking lecture from Sarah. Thank you very much indeed. We have some time for questions. Somebody up there? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Just a couple of short questions. The first is actually referring to your use of the terms sex and gender. I mean, obviously, you are probably aware that there is a lot of debate about that, and also concerning the usefulness of the distinction between those two terms. I think that part of what you've presented to us here today, particularly the first part, if you sit back a little, you might look at it and say, well, doesn't that all these scholars' arguments and even agreements, does that not confirm the idea that actually sex is always already gendered through their discourses, the scholarly discourses about that? I'd also like to know if you could say a little bit more about, you briefly mentioned, I think you used the term obsession or somewhat, maybe some sort of a strange focus on sexual orientation as a late modern concept. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. And related to that is my question. When you talk about marriage as a form of asceticism, albeit sort of lower compared to the ideal of an ideal form of celibacy, what or how would we have to possibly reconceptualize marriage? It seems to me to be quite a heteronormative concept, at least from the particular context, the sources that you're drawing on. Is there any way, is that something that is inherent to this concept of marriage, or can it be overcome, and if so, how?
Thank you. I'm delighted to talk about this. It goes slightly beyond what I'm actually doing in the lectures, but it's something on which I've written elsewhere. First of all, on sex and gender, I decided not to bog down into a discussion about how the carving up of the distinction between those terms was standard in the 70s and 80s and then was undermined by Judith Butler and others in a way that I think is very convincing, because I'm dealing here with a discourse, the scientific one, which apart from a few feminist philosophers of science is absolutely uncomprehending about that issue. But I think perhaps we do need to distinguish between the eye of the beholder problem, where it seems to me there was plenty of evidence tonight that, simply writing and talking about sexual activities in animals brought in all kinds of gender presumptions. And on the other hand, different kinds of problems in the natural material itself. So that, for instance, it's different, it seems to me, to comment on the fact that you found some intersex bears, all right, from discussing the issue of exactly how males and females relate to one another in a nest, etc., etc. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So one is focused on a very rare and unexpected physiology. The other is a matter of seeing what's happening, and there, in that second realm, you're almost immediately straight back into the eye of the beholder problem. Now, I think this is where Roughgarden is particularly interesting, because she really has opened the floodgates here, and this is where Clutton-Brock is very happy to go along with her, to asking the question, well, look, when we're interested in how the next generation appears in any species, what kinds of things are we interested in? If we're solely and only interested in, quote, genetic success, we're going to be missing an awful lot of the drama, because there will be forms of behavior which may be really very differential even between pairs, let alone, or involve more than pairs. And it's very interesting that this stuff is suddenly falling out. No one's seen it before. Mm-hmm. So first point, absolutely given to you, although I think there are some internal complexities. Now the second question was...
was about sexual orientation.
Yes, right. I did a throwaway remark there. I personally loathe this term because it is a very novel and recent construction. And one of the fascinating things, and it boxes people. And one of the fascinating things about the ascetical theology of the late antique period in particular is that it is so insightful about the malleability and fluidity of sexual attraction, but also of gender transformations through a lifetime, through a series of different encounters in love, and so on and so forth. And it's completely relaxed about that. The reason it's relaxed about it is that it sets the whole business in a framework of love for God. And that becomes, therefore, the encompassing narrative in which relationships and responses are adjudged, not depending on what your orientation is, which is an idea they simply don't have, but whether you are aligning your desires with God's desires for you. Now that's really the answer to the third question, because I think the churches have got themselves backed into an absolutely ludicrous corner out of which there is no escape. And the question we should be asking is not really, should we call homosexual marriages marriages, but rather, how many people want to make lifelong vows of fidelity? Whether as monks or as same-sex partners or as heterosexual partners. And that should be the test question for the churches. That should be our witness, and not this whipping up of hatred, which is based on, in my view, a false presumption about the nature of our sexual lives anyway.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Phil.
Thank you very much. Could I ask a question about the options we have intellectually for relating the human and the non-human activities you're discussing here? I was thinking, you spoke occasionally this evening about precursor behavior, which sets up one kind of relationship. Is there scope for conceiving of those relationships as, I don't know, analogies or types and antitypes or stages? I mean, what is there? And is there any one question which would help us choose between those range of possibilities?
That's a very subtle question, and I'm not sure it's something that I have completely worked out an answer to yet. So by all means, help me. Because of the, I showed you the picture of the tree of life. I mean, we know that Darwinian theory gives us examples of branchings in the genetic tree. And we also know that there is a definite sense in which the higher apes are our precursors, all right? So I think to that extent, yes, precursor is part of the picture. But I think it's more complicated than that, as I've already indicated this evening, so that not only is there a precursor sensibility, but then there's also, when you get into the human realm, the very specific character that we have as humans are being able to make both sinful and good choices. So the moral realm emerges seriously for us in a way that it can't for most animals. I mean, I'm leaving open the possibility that there is this continuum, so that you can talk in some sense, for instance, of dolphins having beliefs and good behaviors and so on. And what that means is that uniquely as humans, we have the capacity to behave worse than animals, as well as considerably better. And we also have the capacity to read stories into them, which create then interesting hermeneutical circles of mutual interaction, which in a way I was playing with a little bit tonight. So I think that I have to have those three different models going on simultaneously. To opt for one of them alone would probably be to mislead or to create a discourse that is too lean. Does that make sense? And yeah.
Well, I think we've exhausted the questions, and there may be a degree of exhaustion in the minds in terms of this fascinating articulation of ideas, which you will carry on with next Tuesday. But just a reminder that there are these events on Sunday, obviously the church service, which takes place every Sunday in term time in King's Chapel, and the showing of the film in the evening. Can I thank you very much for attending tonight, and I hope we'll see you in the remainder of this series. And can I thank Sarah very much indeed for this fourth lecture in the series. Thank you.